Hello, I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode of the Dairy Edge, dairy specialist Joe Patton quantifies the fodder reserve required on farm to cope with adverse weather conditions, and first looks back at the cause of the fodder deficit in 2018.
First thing perhaps that we had an adverse autumn, we had an adverse spring, and we had a dry summer. Almost three weather incidents that rolled one into the other in some parts of the country. Okay, and that put particular pressure in particular areas of the country. Now, anywhere that really sort of experienced either just the one of them or none of them at all, but everywhere got hit with at least one problem in the last 18 months. But wherever there was only maybe one problem, people tended to cope quite well. But as those big parts of the country, and particularly some of the more intensive livestock areas, got hit with three consecutive issues, which did contribute to it ran down the reserves. It ran down the reserves quite low in a lot of cases. So, but when you do look at that and you see how the country managed to cope with it in terms of catching up in the latter part of the year, you would be encouraged that people very much sort of farms the way out of the problem. Like you think about, how I know, granted that we had the benefit of a pretty good winter just gone. Like the winter of 2018-19 was quite kind to us, I suppose. But when you look at the country actually pulled out of the deficit in quite well in hindsight. So I suppose really the short answer is that we ended up in a situation where we had a series of weather events coming back to back, which really tested the reserves on a lot of farms.
And I guess a comment, Joe, that I would have heard a lot was that it was farmers that had gone too far in terms of cow numbers, that had carrying very high stocking rates. I don't know, was that the case? I think everyone was affected in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. Oh, look, I mean, that's a very it's a very understandable assumption to make, or a conclusion to come to on it, Emily. And we have to say that in some cases that conclusion would be valid. There is no doubt that there are some farms that probably carried more stock than the farm could allow for. And I suppose we have to remember that those may not be the biggest farms out there. They may not be the most highly stocked farms either. That, I think we need to change the measure there a little bit in people's mind from being highly stocked to being overstocked. Okay? There's a difference. Highly stocked farms that had good reserves in place and had good productivity in their soils or good productivity in their sports through better soils and good management, obviously will have a long-term capacity to carry more stock than farms that perhaps have poor soil fertility, no reseeding done, no feed budgeting done, no grass measurement done. So absolutely, overstocked farms felt the pinch, but our overstocked farms and highly stocked farms, same thing, not necessarily.
And to follow on from that, that's a really interesting statement, overstocked, and that can often be, I suppose, the number of animals relative to the means of your farm to grow grass. And I guess following on from that, there sometimes is confusion between how much feed allowance we have per cow and the feed utilised in terms of, there's often a talk of 5.5 tons or 6 tons of feed. If we look at the allowance for a cow, so say if we look at one cow, what is her annual feed allowance?
Well, I would say that if we were talking about from a marrying into grass grows a little bit to make it easier, we would say that to bring in for enough forage basically to cover the cow for the year, you're talking at least 5.5 tons of grass grown. Okay, allowing a little bit for utilisation, but at the very least 5.5 tons of grass grown with the supplement on top of that. Okay, so you could say that, different herds will have different levels of supplementation depending on yield, etc., etc. But we need 5.5 tons of forage, Louise, and we take the concentrate above that. So very simply then, if your farm is growing 11 tons, the stocking rate, the stock carrying capacity of that farm is 11 divided by 5.5, which is 2 cows per hectare, 2 livestock units per hectare. Okay, that's where it's at. And no higher than that. So grass growth versus demand is it's a fairly simple sum, but that's the type of numbers that we come to. So it's surprising, and I think it's understandable too, I suppose, that people read about stocking rate and people talk about stocking rates of 2.7 and 3 and whatever it might be. It does. I mean, talking about stocking rate without reference to grass growth capacity is very, very dangerous. Very, very dangerous indeed. So, for example, we did some work with this in the spring with our own advisors and with some groups as well, looking at, how short of silage would you be depending on your growth rate. Let's say you're stocked at 2.5 cows to the hectare, 2.5 to the hectare. If you're growing 15.5 tons, you'll have a slight surplus in silage. If you're growing 13.5 tons, you're going to be short about a bale per cow equivalent of silage. And if you're growing only 10.5 tons, you're going to be short 5.5 silage bales per cow equivalent. And that's all at 2.5 stocking rate. So, grass growth obviously has a major, major effect on what we call optimum stocking rate. So highly stocked and overstocked is totally different at the same cows per hectare measurement. Okay, if that makes sense.
And I guess, look, when we look at all the variables that you're talking about there, you're talking about, the number of cows per hectare and the feed allowance. But like the big determinant, like based on what you're saying, is that we're looking at the grass growth, and a lot of us still don't have a handle on exactly how much we're growing. So that's a very good starting point.
Well, I think it would probably surprise some people that if you said that you're growing 13.5 tons, right, which is not that far from the pasture-based average on a normal year. Like on a normal year up till the average pasture-based growth for farms, and that would be farms would be growing and measuring, so you'd imagine that they're going to be at the better side of the thing. They're growing about 13.7, 13.8 tons dry matter, there or thereabouts, which is just about capable of supporting about 2.45 livestock units per hectare, there or thereabouts, right? The bottom 10% of farms on pasture base are growing around 10 tons, which is actually able to support about 1.8 to 1.9 livestock units per hectare. So, I think just as things have changed, and we see a lot of research work done on stocking rates, and we see very highly productive farms in the media and in our own publications, and a FarmWalks talking about stocking rate up 2.5 and all the rest, and that is achievable given the quality of pasture and the growth rate of pasture that they're talking about. But for our average person and our average growth rate, the whole farm stocking rates of about 1.9 is probably as far as it goes until productivity in sports is improved.
And that really, when you say that 1.9 based on grass growth potential on the farm currently, that's your optimum. So you're not making surpluses in the average year on that farm.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think that's one thing that, I suppose, it's one thing that we've been trying to sort of get a conversation going on, that is that when we talk about stocking rate and change in stocking rate in order to build a feed reserve, we sort of really, I would contend that optimum stocking rate and then having a feed reserve are two separate but related questions, right? That the optimum stocking rate, if you're ideally, if you're optimally stocked, you end up with, you basically use your last bale on the day you need your last bale, if you know what I'm saying, and that's it. It's perfectly balanced. You use what you need, and there's not a huge surplus or a huge deficit around that. That you just have about enough. That's what the optimum would be. Now, if we run an optimal stocking rate, we do need then to have a reserve over and above that in case that our grass growth drops away from what we have set the farm to suit. Okay, so we should be looking at optimum stocking rate based on the long-term growth rate on the farm, the long-term growth potential on the farm, and then we need to be looking at a feed reserve as a once-off measure almost to complement that in case things go a little bit awry in terms of growth rate. So, if we took the approach of saying I'm going to understock the farm in order to have enough feed reserve, we will end up missing an opportunity to have more maybe milk output or more productivity. We just end up in a situation where we end up accumulating too much silage. Basically, we just need to be a bit careful to define the two things as slightly separate. So we would be saying stock the farm optimally, make sure that it can grow enough to meet the farm's demand on a sort of 5-year average. But on top of that, then we should be looking at, as a once-off option, looking at maybe bringing a bit of reserve in just to keep us in check in case things go a bit wrong with growth rate.
Can you quantify that reserve for us, Joe? Like, say, on a per cow basis?
Look, on a per cow basis, a bit of how long is a piece of string, Louise? But I would say that if you're maybe slightly higher stocked, if the risk is higher, and maybe ground conditions are maybe at risk as well. So maybe the best way of looking at that is farms that have more variation year on year in their growth rate. Okay, so for example, if you just take two research farms for example, the Ballyhaise farm, I think from memory, the Ballyhaise farm has a greater degree of variability in its growth rate than perhaps maybe the Curtains farm in Moore Parkwood. So when you have a bigger degree of variation, there's probably going to be more years where you're going to be running into a bit of an issue. So in that case, more risk, you would be talking about probably something like in and around sort of 3 bales per cow equivalent, or 600 kilos dry matter of silage as a reserve. Possibly on a less risky farm, you're probably talking more like 400 kilos. So maybe, 2 bales equivalent or thereabouts. And that's of silage over and above what you would have made for your optimum stocking rate. That's the scale of the reserve you're almost getting from an additional source or whatever it might be.
And in terms of that additional silage, are you looking at, say, by and large, if you're at optimum stocking rate, you're not making a lot of surplus in the majority of years. Are you looking at going out and purchasing this reserve to put in the yard, say, this year, based on running down reserves and stocks in the yard in 2018?
Yeah, I think, I fully take the point that, cash flow can be tight, and do people want to tie themselves into having a lot of feed in the yard, and is that cash wasted or whatever? But I don't think, based on, if you think about it, last year, the deficit last year was close to a ton of dry matter per cow. We're really saying that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the large deficit should be accounted for by having a bit of a reserve. So I would be saying, look at depending on the degree of risk on your farm, and it's up to everyone to make their own decision on that, but it's not a big load to carry to say that on a year like this where forage seems to be plentiful, the cost of it is well down from where it was. Would it be prudent for somebody to maybe invest a little bit in building a bit of a feed reserve? I think that it depends on whether you want to take the risk of next year being the same as last year, I suppose. I think it would be something we would be encouraging people that are on the riskier end of things to certainly go and do. Now, look, at this stage of the year, it's probably gone, at this stage of the year, perhaps it's gone, we've missed the boat a little bit, in that there was plenty of grass silage to be gathered up at this, and it's something I would say that perhaps might be slightly late thinking about it for 2019, but certainly for 2020, it's probably something you'd be setting out a plan for. Now, look, just to be clear on that, we are not talking about a situation where somebody goes gets themselves tied into a system where they're buying in additional silage and being reliant on that to balance the feed budget year on year. This is simply a once-off type of an arrangement where you would just buy some surplus silage from a neighbour who has it, for example, on the stem, maybe as a once-off, maybe get some, if it's maize, if that's the area that suits, maybe as a once-off do that as well. But we're not talking about driving up stocking rate on the back of a lot of purchase feed. That's a very important distinction. I think that needs to be remembered. We really are talking here about if you have, let's say, a standard 100 cow herd, that they go and they make an effort of just securing an extra 300 or 400 bales equivalent or an extra bit of pit silage from somewhere as a once-off, and leave it at that, and don't drive your stocking rate up on the back of having don't drive your stocking rate up on the back of a lot of expensive purchase silage.
Yeah, I guess this silage or maize we're talking about is something that's going to sit in the yard, you know, that it isn't for eating in the year, essentially. And
exactly, and it's a rolling stock. Like, it's not that whatever you have, that's your, you know, it's not as if this silage reserve is going to sit over in the corner labelled silage reserve. It just goes into the general stock, and it's going to be a rolling, you know, it's a rolling stock basically. So if you bought an extra couple of hundred bales this year and fed them, you're going to end up with a heel of a pit extra next year that you wouldn't have had. There's your reserve. That's how you put your reserve in the pit. You know what I'm saying? It's the mechanics of it is quite simple. Like, you just, if you buy stuff that won't keep, feed it first, and the stuff in the pit will be, you'll have extra stuff left in the pit for next year. You have built your reserve then, and that's you. It just puts you ahead, just puts you that wee bit ahead, and maybe puts a bit of comfort in the system.
And then, in terms of getting best value for money, what would you target? Are you targeting, say, you know, leasing a farm for 12 months and fertilising it and cutting? Are you looking to cut, say, to purchase on the stem? Like, what's your advice there, Joe?
Yeah, hugely variable. And look, there's no one answer to that, Louise, really, except to say that, you know, look, any silage is going to cost you, you know, it's going to cost, I suppose you're trying to get it in for 17, ideally under 17 cent a kilo dry matter, or 170 euros per tonne of dry matter. So on a lot of farms that maybe are poor for soil fertility and need a lot of work, it's almost impractical to take that as conacre for 1 year for cutting silage. An awful lot of it, I think, would be done as silage on the stem from surpluses from farms that have, for whatever reason, have lower demand than their growth rate. I think purchasing on the stem, while expensive, we just remember we are talking about something that's a relatively small amount of silage in terms for the overall scheme of things. And you may not have to buy all the reserve in the 1 year. It might be just buy a bit extra this year and buy a bit extra next year and build it up over time. But yeah, look, you know, if I was looking at the long-term leasing of a block, you're almost going to end up then incorporating that into your stocking rate decisions, then, aren't you? Because it's under your own control. Whereas, sort of taking opportunities for silage as they arise and being ready to be able to take those opportunities as they arise would seem to me to be the better option in the short term to build bits of reserves, because there was plenty of that kind of stuff around this year. You take it as you get it. Now, that does bring me on to one thing you're just thinking on, that for a lot of farms, perhaps the one thing that's lacking on a lot of farms in order to manage feed reserves is the capacity to store additional silage. You know, it's a feature of a lot of farms where silage pits, as in silage storage areas, have become too small for the scale of what people need to have in the yard. And I know that people possibly don't like handling or buying bales because they're hard to handle and they don't keep. There's a case to be made for saying, well, your reserve does need kind of to be pit silage in a way. I know you can use your bales to help manage it a little bit, but if we had the capacity for storage, I think we could probably do a better job gathering up reserves over a 2 or 3 year period.
And finally then, Joe, looking ahead to the winter of 2019, I know speaking to farmers at the open day in July in Moore Park, they were saying that, you know, their first cut, they ended up making 60% of their feed requirements for the winter. Can you give us some advice on some steps that we can take right now to have a look around the yard and see what we have in terms of winter fodder and how we can assess whether we have a deficit or we have enough for winter?
I think so. Look, Eloise, I think it's a very important one. There's a perception abroad. I think there is a perception out there that everybody's fine for feed this year, and largely you would sort of think that has to be close to it's close enough to the mark. But how far ahead are we really? And there's bound to be farms as there always are that are maybe a little bit short. So there is need for people rather than just measuring on the years when you think you're short, you probably need to be measuring every year, measuring the stocks. So certainly doing a feed budget out in terms of cow numbers by the number of days. Certainly, there's so many templates out there to do that. There's actually a very good one now on pasture base as well as been added, like an online one which you can save up on pasture base and review it over time. That would be something that people could do if they're on pasture base, is just measure their pits, count the bales in the yard, stick it into the feed budget program there, and then your cow numbers, and it'll give you an estimate of whether you're short or whether you're not. So certainly that should be done in good time now. I suppose late August is a good time to look about doing that. And then if people are significantly short, which you'd say the numbers that are going to be significantly short they're not going to be huge. But then you do look at the old story of saying, well, are there cows that I should offload early, or culls I should offload early to make the difference? Do I need to go now and buy before things are, buy a bit of extra silage? Perhaps is probably the easiest thing. Feeding restricted meals, probably not a lot of appetite for that. So I would imagine the best thing to do is take a look at your cow numbers, a quick budget for those, quick measurement on your pits plus your bales, maybe get your Teagasc advisor to do the sums with you, and then see what plus or minus you're short. And based on what you can see out there, there is forage available for purchase. Buy a little bit at the start of the year if you think you need it. And don't go into the winter second guessing. That would be the main thing.
Look, I think that's a great note to finish on, Joe. And as you say, where farmers do have questions, their Teagasc advisors, their discussion groups, and indeed pasture base are there to help in terms of making the calculations and looking at alternatives where they're short. Yeah,
because look, I think that's the thing, and length by breadth by height divided by X, Y, or Z. It all depends on your dry matters and the height of your pit and all that. So it can get a bit confusing. So I think, rather than get into all that, I think you just take your measurements, your physical measurements, and then, your Teagasc advisor will help you get the figure on a page then to work it out. And that's the thing to do. And go into the winter with a bit of confidence in it, Emma Louise. That's what I would say.
That's great. Thank you, Joe.
Not at all. Okay. Thank you.
And that's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Joe Patton for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.